It's a pleasure to be here. I was sort of surprised that I'm going to be doing the chapel in the gymnasium tomorrow, and the poetry reading in the chapel. So I've had to eliminate the racier poems I was going to recite, and make sure you only have things that are appropriate to this venue. I thought I would begin by just talking a little bit about the nature of poetry, and then start to work some poems into it. Poetry is really the most ancient human art. This goes back before history to a time when what we now think of as very separate arts, song, poetry, dance, were all really a kind of performance of telling the stories, singing the songs of a tribe. Robert Frost was once asked to define poetry, and he gave a brilliant definition. He said it's a way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget. A way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget. And poetry goes back to a time in human history before writing. And if you wanted to remember those things that if you lost, you, your family, your people were impoverished, you put it into verse. In our society today, I don't think poetry is very well understood. For millennia, poetry was very badly taught. Consequently, everyone loved it. About 70, 80 years ago, they found a really intellectually brilliant way of teaching poetry, of analyzing it, taking it apart, largely so that you can write papers about it. And ever since then, poetry's popularity has declined rapidly. And I think that what we have to get back to the notion of poetry is reconnecting it with pleasure and with wisdom. What poetry is our most concise, expressive, and memorable way of describing our experience of being human in words. I'm going to make the cameraman work. I'm going to move so that he can't just sit there and sort of zone out. Dun, 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 dun. And as long, and people say, well, isn't poetry outmoded? And it is true that in the same way that a lot of the things that Dickens did has been taken over by TV miniseries and movies, a lot of what poetry, does has been in some ways taken over by the other arts, but at the core of what poetry represents is something irreplaceable to our humanity. As long as we use words to describe our lives to each other, to ourselves, to God, we will need poetry. We will need a way of doing it which is so condensed, so expressive, so unforgettable that it bears the weight of what it means to be human. Now, as a poet, I often get phone calls from strangers, and they usually ask, can I recommend a poem? What two occasions do you think they ask me for? Weddings, funerals. I mean, why? Now, why do they do this? I mean, I don't know who's getting married. I don't know who's passed away. It's because there's a kind of basic human wisdom that in those experiences in which the joy or the sorrow is really more than we can bear, that we need great language to carry the weight of our emotion, to carry the weight of our experience, to even honor the event. So my sense of poetry, is that it is not an elite art. It is an art whose pleasures, whose wisdom should be open to anyone who is alert and curious. And for that reason, I also felt that writing today, I think means to regain some of the oral energy that poetry once had. Poetry, if you think about it, comes from the same wellspring as song. And we hear music differently than we read language. When you hear a poem, when you hear music, you hear it inside your body, inside your mind. It's not something that you can visually separate yourself. So a lot of what I've done has been to try to regain the kind of musical, the acoustic pleasures of poetry. Let me give you an early poem of mine. This was written shortly after I got married. My wife and I came home one night to find a bouquet of flowers waiting on our doorstep. It was not addressed to anybody, and it was signed only with a first name. The trouble is that it was a first name like Dana, that could either be a male or a female name. And so I claimed I didn't know anybody with that name who would send me flowers. My wife claimed that she didn't know anybody with that name who would have sent her flowers. So we brought the flowers in, we put them on the kitchen table, and they sat there sowing dissent. And so I wrote this poem called Thanks for Remembering Us. The flowers, sent here by mistake, signed with a name that no one knows, are turning bad. We should thank, wait, excuse me, sorry, I changed the tense of a verb. The flowers, sent here by mistake, signed with a name that no one knew, are turning bad. What shall we do? Our neighbor says they're not for her, and no one has a birthday near. We should thank someone for the blunder. Is one of us having an affair? At first we laugh, and then we wonder. The iris was the first to die, enshrouded in its sickly sweet and lingering perfume. The roses fell one petal at a time, and now the ferns are turning dry. The room smells like a funeral, but there they sit, too much at home, accusing us of some small crime, like love forgotten. And we can't throw out a gift we've never owned. This afternoon, before I came here, Time Warner Cable showed up with a film camp crew to my office to interview me about poetry out loud. And they kept asking me more and more questions. I kept saying, I gotta get on the road, I gotta get on the road. And one more question. And they asked me, well, talk about your creative method as a poet. And I said, I have the worst creative process of any poet who's ever written. And I'll give you one example. There was a poem I'm about to read. I began about 35, 36 years ago. I was single. I went to this walk through an apple orchard with this girl I liked. She and I were very, very close, and but we sort of went our separate ways. And the next day I started writing a poem about it, but I got it started, but I didn't know where it went. So about every year I would go back to it, and I could never figure it out. And then about 30 years later, I figured out what it should be. The trouble is, if you write a poem about what happened to a girl yesterday, and you finish it 35 years later when you're both married to other people, it becomes necessarily a different poem. And so this is a poem called Apple Orchard, and I don't think it needs anything else except to say that I was born in Hawthorne, California, and any of you who've ever seen Hawthorne, California, know how many apple orchards are in Hawthorne. None. So it's called the Apple Orchard. You won't remember it. The Apple Orchard. We wandered through one April afternoon, climbing the hill behind the empty farm. A city boy. I'd never seen a grove burst in full flower or breathed the bittersweet perfume of blossoms mingled with the dust. A quarter mile of trees in fragrant rows arching above us, we walked the aisle alone in spring's ephemeral cathedral. We had the luck, if you can call it that, of having been in love, but never lovers. The bright flame burning, fed by pure desire, nothing consumed, such secrets brought to light. There was a moment when I stood behind you, reached out to spin you toward me, but I stopped. What more could I have wanted from that day? Everything, of course. Perhaps that was the point, to realize that what we will not grasp is lost. I'm, born and raised in California, and when you go outside of California, or if you simply read English or earlier American poetry, you realize the seasons that we take for granted have nothing in common with the seasons of English poetry. Summer is green, winter is snowy. There's the rain, and it's just if you're from California, it doesn't really happen that way. And I think one of the challenges, but also the great opportunities to be a writer from California, is that you're describing a reality, a natural reality, a social reality, a kind of cultural reality that simply doesn't exist elsewhere. And you've got to find the terms for it. I was working back east, and this fellow had gone out to California for the summer, and somebody asked him, well, what was it like? He goes, oh, it was ugly. The hills were all brown. It was hot and dusty. It wasn't beautiful and green like New England. And I got really mad. And so, but I realized that that's how someone from the Northeast would look at California in the summer. So I wrote this poem. And the funny thing is, I didn't think anybody would really like this poem. I didn't think anybody would even understand this poem, except maybe a couple of Californians. The odd thing is that it's come to be my most widely reprinted and widely translated poem. Every country that doesn't get much rain has translated it. And it's called California Hills in August. It's one painfully extended sentence, but when it was published in the New Yorker, the editor judiciously put a period at the end of each stanza, giving it an elegance visually that it didn't quite have grammatically. California Hills in August. It begins with the way an Easterner would see the landscape, and then it shows you the way that a native would. I can imagine someone who found these fields unbearable, who climbed the hillside in the heat, cursing the dust, cracking the brittle weeds, wishing a few more trees for shade. An Easterner especially, who would scorn the meagerness of summer, the dry, twisted shapes of black elm, scrub oak, and chaparral, a landscape August had already drained of green. One who would hurry over the clinging thistle, foxtail, golden poppy, knowing everything was just a weed, unable to conceive that these trees and sparse brown bushes were alive, and hate the bright stillness of the noon, without wind, without motion, the only other living thing, a hawk, hungry for prey, suspended in the blinding sunlit blue. And yet, how gentle it seems to someone raised in a landscape short of rain, the skyline of a hill, broken by no more trees than one can count, the grass, the empty sky, the wish for water. I want to read another new poem. It's spoken by a statue. I don't know if any of you have ever been much in the Southwest, but there's a folk tradition in the Southwest which is that people carve religious statues, and sometimes they're in a little home altar, or they're in the church, or they're in these clubs called moradas, which are sort of devotional men's clubs. And they're very collectible now. You go to museums, you'll see them. You go to galleries in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, they're for sale. And this is spoken by a statue of an angel, which is now in a museum. And it's been damaged. In the Mexican Revolution, when they outlawed the church, they sent troops to vandalize and destroy all the chapels and churches. And so the statue has survived this. And it's about two things. Part of it is about faith, but the other part of it is about what happens when you take a work of art that was created for religious devotion and you turn it into something that's there for aesthetic contemplation. You're changing really the very nature of the thing. It's called The Angel with the Broken Wing. I am the angel with the broken wing, the one large statue in this quiet room. The staff finds me too fierce, and so they shut faith's ardor in this air-conditioned tomb. The docents praise my elegant design above the chatter of the gallery. Perhaps I am a masterpiece of sorts, a perfect emblem for futility. Mendoza carved me for a country church. His name's forgotten now, except by me. I stood beside a gilded altar where the hopeless offered God their misery. I heard their women whispering at my feet, prayers for the lost, the dying, and the dead. Their candles stretched my shadow up the wall, and I became the hungers that they fed. I lost my left wing in the revolution. Even a saint can savor irony. When soldiers were sent to vandalize the chapel, they hit me once, almost apologetically, for even the godless feel something in a church, a twinge of hope, fear, who knows what it is, a trembling unaccounted by their laws, an ancient memory that they can't dismiss. There are so many things I must tell God. The howling of the damned can't reach that high, but I stand like a dead thing nailed to a perch, a crippled saint against a painted sky. I'm going to read another sort of religious poem. This is another poem that I when I wrote, I said, I don't even know if I'll even be able to publish this poem. And the darn thing ended up in the Oxford Book of American Verse. I think it's probably the only Christian poem, in that thing published after 1910 or something like that. To pagans, I have to explain the poem a little. I don't think you'll need much help. It's about a corrupt medieval archbishop. And it's about, oh, do not disturb the archbishop, asleep in the ivory chair. You must send all the workers away, though the church is in need of repair. His reverence is tired of preaching to the halt and the lame and the blind. Their spiritual needs are unsubtle, their notions of God unrefined. The Lord washed the feet of his servants. The first shall be last, he advised. The Archbishop's edition of Matthew has that troublesome passage excised. The Archbishop declines to wear glasses, and his sense of the world grows dim. He thinks that the crowds at the masses have gathered in honor of him. In the crypt of the limestone cathedral, a friar recopies St. Mark. A nun serves stew to a novice. A choir boy sobs in the dark. While high in the chancery office, his reverence studies the glass, wondering which of his vestments would look best at Palm Sunday Mass. The saints in their weather-stained niches weep as the Vespers are read, and the beggars sleep on the church steps, and the orphans retire unfed. On Easter, the Lord is arisen, while the Archbishop breakfasts in bed, and the humble shall find resurrection, and the dead shall lie down with the dead. Now I want to, I think it's a very important mistake always to make in a poetry reading, to do a poem about poetry, which is certainly something nobody wants to hear in a poetry reading, but it's a tradition and I shall honor it. This is if you're a writer, one of the odd things that happens to you when you begin a poem, something new, as you start to write it and the inspiration is hot, you are absolutely sure that this is going to be one of the best poems ever written. With time, your opinion tends to change. And so what I thought I would do is describe to you, not the poems I've written, but the next poem that I plan to write. This poem is called The Next Poem. How much better it seems now than when it is finally done. The unforgettable first line, the cunning way the stanzas run, the rhymes, soft spoken and suggestive, are barely audible at first, an appetite not yet acknowledged, like the inkling of a thirst, while gradually the form appears as each line is coaxed aloud, the architecture of a room seen from the middle of a crowd. The music, that of common speech, but slanted so that each detail sounds unexpected as a sharp inserted in a simple scale. No jumble box of imagery dumped glumly on the reader's lap, or elegantly packaged junk the unsuspecting must unwrap, but words that could direct a friend precisely to an unknown place, those few unshakable details that no confusion can erase, and the real subject left unspoken, but unmistakable to those who don't expect a jungle parrot in the black and white of prose. How much better it seems now than when it is finally written. How hungrily one waits to feel the bright lure seized, the old hook bitten. A lot of my poems, most of my poems really are not autobiographical. I take something that happened, some little piece of it, and I extrapolated it into a story of what might have happened or whatever. But this next poem really happened. And the poem is an odd poem. The poem is written to a redwood tree. The yew in the poem is a redwood tree. And the poem refers to a Sicilian custom, which is when your first child is born, you save the umbilical cord, you wrap it in the roots of a tree, and you plant it. I mean, I think the symbolism of this custom is pretty obvious. It's a way for people who live off the land to literally root themselves into the earth that feeds them. And usually Sicilians, plant a fig tree or an olive tree. If you go to an old Italian neighborhood, there's no matter what the weather is like, there's a scraggly olive tree somewhere in the backyard. And it's about this custom, except that this poem was written shortly after the death of my first son, who died at 4 months of sudden infant death syndrome. And the tree is being planted in his memory. Takes place up in Northern California, Sonoma County, where my parents lived, outside of a town called Sebastopol, which some of you may know. Planting a sequoia. All afternoon, my brothers and I have worked in the orchard, digging this hole, laying you into it, carefully packing the soil. Rain blackened the horizon, but cold winds kept it over the Pacific, and the sky above us stayed the dull gray of an old year coming to an end. In Sicily, a father plants a tree to celebrate his first son's birth, an olive or a fig tree, a sign that the earth has one more life to bear. I would have done the same, proudly laying new stock in my father's orchard, a green sapling rising among the twisted apple boughs, a promise of new fruit in other autumns. But today, we kneel in the cold, planting you, our native giant, defying the practical custom of our fathers, wrapping in your roots a lock of hair, a piece of an infant's birth cord, all that remains above earth of a firstborn son, a few stray atoms brought back to the elements. We will give you what we can, our labor and our soil, water drawn from the earth when the skies fail, nights scented with the ocean fog, days softened by the scatter of bees. We plant you in the corner of the grove, bathed in western light, a slender shoot against the sunset. And when our family is no more, all of his unborn brothers dead, every niece and nephew scattered, the house torn down, his mother's beauty, ashes in the air, I want you to stand among strangers, all young and ephemeral to you, silently keeping the secret of your birth. Let me change the mood. You can already see that, I like the noises you make when you put words together. I like that kind of music. And I've always been tremendously fond, speaking of Victorians, of a late romantic poetry, Victorian poetry, especially a poet like Tennyson. I grew up with my mother, who was a working class Mexican woman who had memorized, Tennyson poems in high school, had, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, into the valley of death rode the 600. But imagine being a poet and being able to write a poem like this. Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I am here at the gate alone, and the spice of the woodbine is wafted aloft, and the musk of the rose is blown. Wow. This is great stuff, and the trouble is, working at places like General Foods or for the U.S. government, you don't have much occasion to write in that kind of high, tragic, romantic vein. But then some years ago, I came across a doomed love affair, and I felt that someone should write a poem about it. A friend of mine had a superannuated orange tabby cat named Fred, and she decided to brighten up his twilight years by bringing him home a child bride. And this young cat was immediately smitten by Fred. But this May-December marriage didn't quite work because it was really just too late in December for Fred to reciprocate. And once a month, the young cat would go into heat and chase poor Fred around the house and garden, but nothing ever happened. So I wrote the cat this poem. Poetry provides consolation, what can I say? Come into the garden, Fred, for the neighborhood tabby is gone. Come into the garden, Fred. I have nothing but my flea collar on, and the scent of the catnip is gone to my head. I'll wait by the screen door till dawn. The fireflies court in the sweet gum tree. A nightjar calls from the pine, and she seems to say in her rhapsody, "Oh, mustard brown Fred, be mine." And the full moon sets my whiskers afire, and the fur goes erect on my spine. I hear the frogs in the muddy lake croaking from shore to shore. They've one swift season to soothe their ache. In autumn they sing no more. So ignore me now, and you'll hear my meow as I scratch all night by the door. My kid brother claims that this was written about him, but that's not true. Okay, I'm going to read 4 more poems. I've written the libretti for 2 operas, and the first one is called Nosferatu. It's a retelling of the Dracula story, and I don't think I was fully conscious of this as I began it, but as soon as I got into the material, I realized that it became very much of a Christian allegory about good versus evil. And one of the recurring figures in great Christian poems is the devil. You think of Milton, think of Dante, even think of the versions of him that Shakespeare did with people like Iago, who are consciously fashioned in this way. And so the vampire becomes this. And this is, I want to read you one of the arias. And if you know, I don't know if any of you have seen the Murnau film, which was then remade by Werner Herzog in '79. And actually, about 10 years ago, there was a Hollywood film called The Shadow of the Vampire. William Dafoe actually got an Academy Award nomination, for it with John Malkovich. And it was about the filming of Nosferatu. But if you know any of those versions, you know that as part of the plot, the woman has to come to the vampire willingly. So the question is, in what ways does evil seduce us? And I thought that one of the more interesting ways is, in a sense, and this is something I think that is ubiquitous in American society, which is a kind of surrender to the dark side of one's soul, which is in a sense of surrendering to the dark forces. I mean, why you think of the people that throw themselves into behavior, let's say drugs. I had a nephew 3 weeks ago who died of a heroin overdose. A good kid, he was had a good job and everything else. Why do people do this? And there's a kind of power or excitement that one gets when one descends into the darkness. You can sort of give up the responsibilities. And so the argument that the vampire makes is that this woman has been unhappy all of her life. She's felt cut off from other people. And what he brings to her is the darkness inside of her that she's never acknowledged. This being a chapel, I think I should tell you that generally it's a bad idea to follow the advice of a vampire. But in drama, you have to create characters and let them be who they are. This is Nosferatu's Serenade. I am the image that darkens your glass, the shadow that falls wherever you pass. I am the dream you cannot forget, the face you remember without having met. I am the vow, I am the words that cannot be spoken, the midnight vow that cannot be broken. I am the bell that tolls out the hours. I am the fire that warms and devours. I am the hunger that you have denied, the ache of desire piercing your side. You've heard me inside you, speak in your dreams, sigh in the ocean, whisper in streams. I am the future you crave and you fear. You know what I bring. Now, I am here. Okay, and then this is a ballad that takes place at a wedding. I love the ballad. The ballad is the way we tell stories. And it's not much used by poets anymore, but I think it's a natural form. Summer storm. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry and watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant, beaded light, cool and silent as the stars the storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers, as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as swiftly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the crowd, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word except to say goodnight. Why does this evening's memory return with this night's storm, a party 20 years ago, its disappointments warm? There are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried, other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married, and memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life might be happier just by being different. Two more poems. It's really one and a half. This poem is so short it hardly matters. Just to show you how weird my creative process is, some years ago I was asked by NPR to write a poem for New Year's Day. So I wrote an elegant 36-line poem on the idea of New Year's. And after it was broadcast, I said, let me work on this a little bit. And so I cut it down to 32 lines. And then about a week later, I cut it to 28. And then about a month later, it was at 24, then 20. And I figured it might end up being a sonnet when it hit 16 lines, but it went right to 12. Then it went to 10. And when it got to 8 lines, I realized the problem was that it was too verbose. And so I cut it down to 6 lines, and the poem no longer had anything to do with New Year's. But I think that's how, I'm a real believer that what you're trying to do is collaborate with language and see where the language takes you. And if the language is any good, it takes you into your unconscious. And what this is a poem about is about how much of the life that everyone in this room is leading is invisible to everybody but you. Your inner life is something that every moment, the memories, the imagination, and only you know this. It's called unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead. And I'm going to end with a love poem. It's a poem about two things, which is that we lead our lives by stories. When Jesus spoke, he basically told stories. And we need stories because as our life changes, we're constantly revising the story of who we are, what we want, where we've been. And that's how a healthy life grows. And that's why people need to know of how many plot twists there can be, how when you're in a bad situation, there can be a sudden rescue. People reappear, even deus ex machina, to quote the Greeks, the divine intervention. And that's why literature needs to be part of everyone's education, because without that ability, you do not have the ability to grow into your own true life. That's the first subject. The second subject is about marriage. I will, in about 3 weeks, have been married 32 years. I've been married twice to the same woman. We got married in the Congregational Church, which my Catholic mother never let me forget. So a few years later, we got married in the Catholic Church too, And I really come to believe that the basis, or at least one of the real bases of a marriage, is essentially that you have to look on marriage and love as a kind of conversation. That you have your story and you're bringing it to someone else's, and there's a kind of endless palaver that goes on. If you're really in love with someone, something that happens to you isn't real till you tell the other person about it. Until, in a sense, you loop your stories around each other again. And even sex is a kind of conversation. It's a way, in a sense, of becoming one flesh, becoming one spirit. And so that's what this is about. It's a double sonnet. It's a form of sonnet I invented myself out of sheer desperation, I think. 7, 7, 7, and 7. And with each 7, there's a twist of mood. I take my title from Shakespeare, who in Midsummer Night's Dream said, "The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact," which is to say all three of them are crazy. But the weird thing is that being crazy, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet see things about the world that normal people miss. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet. The tales we tell are either false or true, but neither purpose is the point. We weave the fabric of our own existence out of words, and the right story tells us who we are. Perhaps it is the words that summon us. The tale is often wiser than the teller. There is no naked truth but what we wear. So let me bring this story to our bed. The world, I say, depends upon a spell spoken each night by lovers unaware of their own sorcery. In innocence or agony, the same words must be spoken, or the restless moon will darken in the sky, the night grows still, the winds of dawn expire. And if I'm wrong, it cannot be by much. We know our own existence came from touch, the new soul summoned into life by lust, and love's shy tongue awakens in such fire, flesh on flesh in midnight whispering, as if the only purpose of desire were to explore its infinite unfolding. And so, my love, we are two lunatics, secretaries to the wordless moon, lying awake together or apart, transcribing every touch or aching absence into our endless, intimate palaver. Body to body, naked to the night, apparelled only in our utterance. Thank you so much.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.